The Eye of the Dragon. Chapter 1. Lila had always been fascinated by dragons. She loved reading stories about them, drawing pictures of them, and imagining what it would be like to meet one. She dreamed of flying on their backs, breathing fire, and exploring the hidden realms of magic. But she knew that dragons were extinct. The ruthless King Arden had hunted them down and killed them because he feared their power and wanted to acquire their treasures. The last dragon had died over 100 years ago, and only their bones and scales remained in museums and collectors' vaults. Lila lived in a small town on the outskirts of the kingdom, where life was simple and boring. She worked as a waitress at the local inn, serving travelers and locals alike. She had no family, no friends, and no prospects. She felt like she did not belong anywhere. One day, a mysterious stranger came to the inn. He was tall and slender, had long black hair and piercing green eyes. He wore a dark cloak that covered almost his entire body, except for a silver pendant that hung around his neck. It was in the shape of a dragon's eye and glowed faintly in the dim light. Lila was fascinated by him. She sensed that there was something different about him, something mysterious and dangerous. She wanted to know more about him, but he was aloof and closed off. He hardly spoke to anyone and retreated to his room. The next day, when Lila was cleaning his room, she saw the pendant on his nightstand. She could not resist picking it up and looking at it more closely. It felt warm and smooth in her hand, and she felt a strange tingling in her fingers. She looked into the eye and gasped. She saw a flash of fire, a rumble of thunder, and the sight of a majestic being rising into the sky. She felt a wave of emotion, a mixture of awe, fear and joy. She felt a connection, a bond, a call. She dropped the pendant and stumbled back. She heard footsteps outside the door and quickly hid under the bed. The stranger entered the room and closed the door behind him. He walked over to the table and noticed that his pendant was missing. He looked around the room, his eyes narrowing. He sensed that something was wrong, that something was out of place. He reached under the bed and grabbed Lila by the hair. He dragged her out from under the bed and threw her to the floor. He towered over her, his face contorted with rage. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What have you done with my pendant?" Lila was horrified. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She pointed to the pendant on the floor and hoped he would let her go. He followed her gaze and saw the pendant lying on the floor. He picked it up and held it close to his chest. He looked at Lila again, and his expression softened a bit. "You touched it," he said. "You saw it." Lila nodded weakly. He knelt beside her and lifted her chin with his hand. He looked into her eyes and smiled. "You are one of us," he said. Chapter 2. Lila was confused and frightened. She didn't understand what the stranger meant by "one of us." She didn't know who he was or what he wanted from her. She only knew that he had something to do with dragons and magic, and that he wore a pendant that showed her a vision of a dragon. She tried to break away from him, but he held her by the arm. "Let me go," she screamed. "Please, leave me alone." He shook his head. "I can't do that," he said. "You're too important. You're the key to everything." He pulled her up off the floor and dragged her toward the door. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "I'm meeting the others," he said. "To meet your destiny." He opened the door and pushed her out. He looked around and saw that no one was in sight. He whistled softly, and a black horse appeared behind the inn. It was sleek and strong, with a silver mane and tail. He lifted Lila onto the horse and climbed behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist and held the pendant in his hand. "Hold on tight," he said. "We still have a long way to go." He gave the horse a kick, and it galloped away from the town. Lila felt the wind in her hair and the sun on her face. She felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She didn't know where they were going or what would happen to her. She only knew that her life would never be the same again. Chapter 3. Lila and the stranger rode for hours over hills and forests, through rivers and plains. Lila didn't know where they were going or how far they had traveled. She didn't dare ask the stranger anything, afraid of his reaction. He didn't speak to her either, except to tell her to hold on or duck if they encountered obstacles. She wondered who he was and what he wanted from her. She wondered who the others were, and what their destiny was. She wondered if she'd ever see her home again, or if she'd ever be free. She felt a strange connection to the pendant he held in his hand. She felt its warmth and its light, its power and its mystery. She felt a pull, a curiosity, and a longing for it. She wanted to touch him again, to see the dragon again. She also felt a connection to the stranger. She felt his heartbeat and breath, his strength and speed. She felt his feelings and thoughts, his hopes and fears. She felt a bond with him, a trust and an attraction. She didn't know what to make of these feelings. She didn't know if they were real or not. She didn't know if they were good or bad. She only knew that they were getting stronger by the minute. At dusk, they reached a mountain range. The stranger slowed his horse and looked around. "We're almost there," he said. "Where?" asked Lila. "The hidden valley," he said. "The last refuge of the dragons." He pointed to a gap between two peaks. He spurred the horse forward, and they entered the gap. Lila gasped when she saw what lay beyond. It was a valley of green and gold, full of flowers and trees, streams and ponds. It was a valley full of beauty and peace, full of life and joy. And it was a valley of dragons. Lila saw dozens of them, in all shapes and sizes, colors and patterns. They flew in the sky, rested on the ground, played in the water. They roared and laughed, sang and spoke. They were alive. Lila couldn't believe her eyes. She had always thought that dragons were extinct, that they existed only in stories and legends. But they really existed. And they were here. The stranger smiled when he saw her reaction. "Welcome to the Eye of the Dragon," he said. Chapter 4. Lila and the stranger entered the valley and were greeted by a group of dragons. They were of different sizes and colors, but they all had one thing in common: they wore pendants, like the strangers. They were shaped like dragon eyes and glowed in different colors. The dragons surrounded them and looked at them curiously and excitedly. They spoke to them in a language that Lila didn't understand, but the stranger did. He answered them and introduced Lila to them. "This is Lila," he said. "She's one of us." The dragons nodded and smiled. They welcomed her to the valley and told her their names. "This is Zara," the stranger said, pointing to a blue dragon with silver scales. "She's the leader of our clan." Zara lowered her head and looked kindly at Lila. "Hello, Lila," she said, "I'm glad you're here. We've been waiting for you for a long time." Lila felt a wave of emotion. She felt honored and humbled by Zara's words. "I thank you," she said, "but I don't understand. Why did you wait for me? What do you mean by one of us?" Zara smiled. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, "but first I want to introduce you to the others." She pointed to a red dragon with golden scales. "This is Raza," she said, "he's our warrior and protector." Raza grinned and tensed his muscles. "Hello, Lila," he said. "You're very brave to come here. I admire that." He winked at her, and Lila felt her cheeks flush. She looked at the stranger, who rolled his eyes. "Don't pay any attention to him," he said. "He's always flirting with everyone." He pointed to a green dragon with bronze scales. "That's Tara," he said. "She's our healer and teacher." Tara smiled and touched Lila's forehead with her nose. "Hello, Lila," she said, "you have a beautiful soul. I can feel it." She closed her eyes, and Lila felt a wave of warmth and peace wash over her. She looked at the stranger, who nodded. "She's very good at what she does," he said. He pointed to a yellow dragon with silver scales. "That's Kira," he said. "She's our scout and explorer." Kira giggled and flew around Lila's head. "Hello, Lila," she said, "you're very pretty. I like your hair." She landed on Lila's shoulder and played with her hair. She looked at the stranger, who shrugged. "She's very friendly," he said. He pointed to a purple dragon with golden scales. "And this is Mira," he said. "She's our seer and oracle." Mira stared at Lila with her piercing eyes. "Hello, Lila," she said, "you have a great destiny. I can see it." She tilted her head, and a shiver ran down Lila's spine. She looked at the stranger, who sighed. "She's very cryptic," he said. He paused and looked at Lila with his green eyes. "And I'm Zane," he said. "I'm your guide and partner." He smiled and held out his hand. "Nice to meet you," he said.